There were a few comments on my last video mentioning that I may have been a bit harsh or nitpicky, so I'm going to let my better half handle this next one. Amanchu was a series that I had a lot of cautious optimism about going into this season, with director Junichi Sato at the helm, adapting another manga by the author of Aria, one of his most highly regarded directorial endeavors, and a soundtrack by the world guitar duo that composed Yokohama Kaidashi Kiko's. It certainly promised to be a great Iyashikei experience. But the manga's high school setting is a step down from the Marcia Neo-Venetia of Aria, raising some concerns that it might be a good bit more generic. We'll have to see how interesting Amanchu manages to stay over the course of its run, but what really struck me in its first episode is how thoroughly it established some of its core themes. While Aria was more of a slow burn, with a lot of the narrative, emotional, and thematic payoff coming in later seasons, Amanchu set up a lot of thematic material right out of the gate, in a way that I certainly wasn't expecting, doing so quickly while maintaining that relaxing, pleasant pace and atmosphere. So to give you a little behind the scenes, that first paragraph was written as this video's thesis, and then I went back to rewatch the first episode in order to bolster my analysis, and oh my goodness, this show is incredible. The very first scene establishes so much, and I missed all of it my first time through. I'm going to start with the second scene in order to set the stage, but let me just say that this episode is ingenious. So in the second scene, we get a shot of Pikuri's grandmother's shop beside the cliff, followed by a sweeping shot of the ocean, into which Pikuri steps, staring at that ocean. She then turns to look over her shoulder, asking if that's pork soup that she smells. When we come back from the OP, Pikuri excitedly exclaims that she loves the sea, and loves her grandmother's soup as well. This scene is really important in grounding what will be revealed as the series' theme, the wide world of opportunity that is waiting for us to seize it, by emphasizing the value of home as well. That journeying out is fine, and as the series argues, very important, but that exploration doesn't have to come with a rejection of one's home and personal connections. When Teeko enters in the following scene, she looks briefly at the ocean, but then closes and lowers her eyes, perhaps because the sun was in them, or maybe out of simple disinterest. We get some neat visual characterization, with her literally being unsteady in this new environment, and she proceeds to bury herself in her phone, looking over pictures of what seem to be her old friends, and being disappointed when she finds that there are no new messages for her. Her reflection upon her old relationships, along with her general body language and tone of voice, convey that she is somewhat unhappy with her recent move. But the key line, I think, is actually when she says that she hates bikes, and that she is simply using it out of necessity. She doesn't just resent her new home, she resents the freedom, mobility, and possibility that her bike represents, because she'd rather just immerse herself in the familiar, in the past. This takes us back to that first scene. The final 3 out of its 5 shots specifically are of interest. In the first of those, we see Teeko's bike from a high angle, framed very interestingly between the road's center line and the shadow of the cliffside fence. I'm probably reading into this, but that shadow looks like a pair of train tracks to me, with her being off track if we take that to be the case. Next, we get a shot from behind her, high enough off the ground that we just see her and a bit of her bike framed against an open sky. Finally, she drives across our field of view horizontally, this time with the sea as her backdrop. There are a few things to note here. Firstly, we never see her eyes in any of these 5 shots, making the scene feel slightly impersonal, and her specifically tough to read on an emotional level. As beautiful as the scenery is, she is fairly dispassionate. Remember, she hates bikes. The closest we get to that is the final shot, where she stares resolutely ahead, not taking notice of the gorgeous seascape beside her. More importantly, none of these shots feature her, the bike, and the road altogether. At most, we get 2 of them at once. With Teeko and the road never sharing the frame, she feels somewhat disconnected from it, as if she isn't grounded, just floating along. Let's get back to her on the cliffside now. After being asked about it, she tells Pikuri's grandmother that she came out here in order to practice riding the bike and to see the ocean. However, judging from the fact that for her, seeing the ocean mostly involves sitting in front of it with her face buried in her phone, that latter one doesn't seem like much of a concern for her. She didn't come out here due to any sense of exploration or discovery. She's doing it out of an obligation to become suitably proficient with her bike, her freedom. She isn't enjoying and utilizing her freedom, she's simply exercising it in the minimal capacity that she needs to in order to get through life. What drags her out of this a bit is a 2-fold extension of personal connection. Grandma gives her a drink, which catches her a bit off guard as she hesitates a second before taking it and thanking her. And then the sea really catches her attention by greeting her with an enthusiastic wave. It is only at this point that she truly looks at it for the first time, and realizes how wondrous a sight it is to behold. The grandmother's brief speech here establishes the cell phone as a symbolic object, and it certainly could be a bit blatant or heavy-handed, if not for how many different meanings the show manages to pack into it. Most obviously, it is a criticism of cell phones literally. a criticism of people who end up missing the world around them because their phone is the focus of their attention. Her phone, with its pictures of her old friends, is representative of her past, and shows us that at this point she is still very much stuck in it, and also informs us that those things really are behind her, by obscuring the faces of her friends and having her check twice during this episode and have no messages. Her old friends no longer matter. At this point they aren't even real people. They're faceless, something that she will connect with no longer, and the lack of messages only emphasize that severing of ties. Grandma also critiques the escape into familiarity, which is where the episode's earlier assurance that there is still a place for it becomes important, criticizing it when that familiarity is relied upon and sought after to the point that it blinds us to the wonders of the new and unfamiliar, in this case the sea, which itself serves as a representation of the vastness of the possibilities that lie before us. Of course, the series doesn't take the cheesy route of this being an earth-shattering revelation that entirely shifts Teeko's worldview. We see her back up on the cliff, on her phone once more, and Grandma remarks that the world in there must be much bigger, for now, establishing a path that Teeko's development as a character can follow over the course of the series, as she further detaches herself from her obsession with the past. And then in a little bit, when we see Teeko drive off, the kernel of that change manifests itself, with her and the road finally sharing a shot. She has now been grounded, and has some kind of road to follow. When Teeko arrives at school the next day, she thinks about the unfamiliarity of her new environment in some kind of negative light. Whether with trepidation or simply discontent, I don't know for certain, once again emphasizing that her attitudes, while not held as absolutely as they may have been previously, are largely unchanged at this point. When she meets up with Pikuri at the shoe lockers, she is presented firsthand with an example of the alternative to those attitudes, with Pikuri expressing excitement and even elation at the prospect of an unfamiliar place to explore. A few moments later, Teeko first characterizes Pikuri as optimistic, but then revises that and concludes that she just seems to be enjoying herself. That instead of any kind of conjecture about what the future may hold, Pikuri is simply reveling in and enjoying the present here and now. When she gets to the classroom and finds her seat, Teeko begins staring out the window, but instead of observing the world outside, her thoughts are once again on her old friends. When it comes time for introductions and she is trying to think of what to say, she discards the idea of talking about her old home, believing that her classmates would find that boring. So to some degree she is aware of the fact that her old life is no longer that relevant. She then moves on to hobbies, realizing that she doesn't really have any, nor can she think of anything she particularly likes. In contrast to Pikuri, who has a very strong passion, this suggests to me that Teeko had always kind of gone through the motions, which is why she hasn't thought to look for value in her new life outside of her old friendships, and why she doesn't have anything in particular that she is personally invested in. By the time they're lining up for textbooks, Teeko's attitude has begun to turn, with her now referring to the newness of people like Pikuri and her teacher, and more broadly, everything here, in a much more positive tone. Finally, we get the most message scene in this episode.
I guess even though we were free, we were still slaves in the mind. Message!
The teacher's speech where she lays out what seems to be the series' own personal philosophy towards its subject matter. I think that for such an explicit scene, it is actually fairly well done, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is narratively justified. It makes total sense and occurs in a situation that doesn't feel constructed just in order to give the series an opportunity to express this sentiment. This is the typical start-of-the-year speech from a teacher to her students, a place where these things are regularly expressed in reality. Additionally, it's a neat parallel, with the teacher being an authority expressing these thoughts to her student, and the series being the authority on its own ideas expressing them to its audience. This is helped by the self-awareness and humility with which it is done. The teacher felt pumped up about the statement, feeling like it was cool, but then gets a bit insecure about it, deferring to the students and asking if they share this belief. This shows that the series isn't necessarily holding up its ideas as the absolute truth, and leaving things open for us as audience members to have some disagreements. It further justifies this by making sure that that statement doesn't serve the purely mechanical purpose of giving us some intellectual wiggle room, because it also serves to characterize the teacher. Her personal philosophy tells us a great deal about her, of course, but her desire to be a cool-sounding role model, and her bit of insecurity about whether or not she comes off as that, is really endearing, and gives us a better idea of who she is. In reflecting upon these statements, Teeko says that she doesn't quite understand them at present, and that a more pressing concern for her is her life in this new setting, but sees it as a real possibility, and indeed even seems to hope that she will come to share this sentiment of appreciating and enjoying the new, the unfamiliar, and more broadly the world around her in general. It is also left to us, the audience, to see whether or not these attitudes and this worldview will win us over, and if we will come out of the series sharing them, or some piece of them at least. Honestly, in analyzing this first episode, I was blown away. This video was initially just going to be a short analysis of how well handled that one conversation between Teeko and Grandma on the cliffside was at establishing the themes of this series. It was only in revisiting it a second time that I realized just how much information, characterization, and thematic development was packed into this episode. And the most amazing thing about all of that is that it still works brilliantly as an Iyashikei series. It's up there with Amama to Inazuma this season in terms of personal enjoyment for me, and it is so damn relaxing and pleasant. It astounds me how something so laid-back, relaxed, and loose is also so tightly written, and so tightly packed with ideas and development of those ideas. And if these glowing remarks have yet to convince you, they're also totally gay. Go watch Amanchu.